So thank you for inviting me, Roy, and I've really enjoyed the first two papers of this colloquium, and I think I'm going to be speaking to some of the points raised in those papers as well. And I want to think about enslaved children from Roman and late antique Egypt, spread across quite a few hundred years, partly because that's how the accident of the survival of the documents that I'm going to be looking at. And I look at children in the past as a particular group and as individuals, particularly from Egypt, because they are a group that are silenced or hidden from history more than perhaps many other individuals and groups. So enslaved children are particularly hidden, and one of the things I want to do today is purely to show you some of the material, because it's something that's not discussed, not brought together very much, and understudied from particular perspectives. So I want to kind of show you some of that material, think about some of the questions that I think about when I'm reading some of it. And we have to remember that the ancient Mediterranean demographically was a young population. So the demographic dynamics of this world featured a relatively high proportion of children to adolescents, comparative with later societies. And they were visibly present in their multitudes across the cities, towns and villages of the ancient world, especially in Egypt, where we have all of this documentary material for them. And a significant proportion of these young people would have been of slave status, some having been enslaved through means of warfare, others born into slavery, and I'll talk about that, and many of them having been traded and transported and moved some distances. Don't worry, I'm not going to show a lot of slides like this, but I just wanted to introduce you to quite a small amount of scholarship on the nature of enslaved children and the study of child slavery in the ancient Roman world. It's mostly appeared as tangential points in discussions of things like the slave supply or the slave education system and child labour and child work in the context of slavery, and some discussion of aspects of sexual exploitation as well, of course. We do have some well-known studies of legal procedures of sales and the price and value of different types of enslaved people from various of these works, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And only a handful of studies on enslaved children have dealt with issues of their experience and the experience of enslaved children, where they came from, what kinds of impact the experience of being transported or slavery or work or labour or exploitation has had on them. And that's very difficult to do because, of course, we don't have any surviving written testimony from any enslaved people in the ancient world, as far as I'm aware, certainly not of any children. And it's something that's makes it very difficult to try and get at that aspect of the experience of these people. And there are, of course, various topics which I'm not going to go into too much today in the interest of time, but there's very little done on the system, and I would say it is systematic, but that's perhaps something we can discuss later on, of child trafficking in the Roman world. And there's a fantastic recent PhD thesis from Kelsey Madden on this topic. So, there are several important questions to be asked. How were the experience of slavery shaped by the age and the nature of childhood, as distinct from adults? What can we observe from the material or infer from it about the experiences of children who've been enslaved? And does the scale and the geographic scope of child enslavement practices tell us anything about the broader treatment of children in this world, the ancient world? What kinds of impacts did it have on children's lives? And how can we understand even relationships between children who were of slave status and those who were of freeborn status, who remained free, with whom they came into regular contact? So, the material from Egypt's already been mentioned today. Here's some more of it. I am going to show you snippets. Almost every picture I have is of a papyrus, but I just want to show you these papyri that we're working from. They're fantastic. And this one's particularly well preserved. Usually the gap or the lacuna is right where the interesting text was. But we're quite lucky in a respect that from Egypt, of course, we have a wealth of different types of documentary material. Some of these take the form of private letters, some of them contracts, some of them receipts, some of them petitions. There's lots of work. The census data is really interesting because it tells us about the ways in which people formed their families. They give you a snapshot of what a household looked like as it was recorded by the head of household. But in fact, we have to be very careful with it because it was a taxation document. So obviously people lied in the census documents. And you can trace that. I've written about that before. You can trace individual families across successive censuses, and there are apparent inconsistencies. So it does look like people have been hidden at various times. But here you can see an example of something that's quite typical, is a freeborn or a free man with two daughters, one aged 15, one aged 20, and there are 4 individuals who are listed as slave status, and I've just given you the details there. 2 of those slaves live with the man and his 15-year-old daughter, 2 of them with the 20-year-old daughter as well. And you see quite a lot in these material, the ages of these children who are enslaved are similar to the ages of the free children in the house as well. That's a common pattern that we keep seeing. And of course, some of these children are with their own mothers who are also enslaved. But what are the likely origins of these children and their status? So obviously, we have to look to all kinds of material for that. But the striking thing to think is, it's already been mentioned by both our speakers earlier on, is this issue of homeborn slaves, or slaves, I don't like to use the term bred, but this idea that there's an inherent value in the Roman slave-owning class's mindset to having a person who is born into slavery. They are particularly more valuable, as his lordship would say. And we have lots of evidence for this kind of situation, children being born into slavery and remaining there. So we get this in things like this, we'll talk about this more, but this is an exception to this rule. This is a boy, Melas, who was a foundling, an exposed infant, abandoned, who was collected and raised with his destiny, unfortunately, being slavery. But he ends up in a situation in one of these cities, Oxyrhynchus, which is a Hellenized elite city in the Roman Empire, which has these metropolitan elite groups. And the way you put forward your membership of that group is hereditary. You put yourself forward, or your sons forward, at age 13 or 14 through this method, the epicrisis, and we have all of these registration documents. But what we find in this material is examples of slave children also being put forward in this, in these things, alongside, in some cases, the free children from the same household. And this is something my colleague Villy and I have found when we went systematically through all 7,500 published documents of Oxyrhynchus for our book, and we found this is quite a common pattern. So, what about these homeborn slaves in Roman terminology, in Latin, but in the Greek here in the material oikogenes? We've got lots of material. Here's another famous papyrus detailing some of this. We have documentation detailing the transactions of enslaved children, acknowledging their status as one who was born in the house, oikogenes. And here we've got an example of that. From the Arsinoite nome, an important Hellenized region of Egypt in the 1st century, a 6-year-old girl is listed as being homeborn enslaved. And this agreement in this document, where she's being transacted, appears to have been between 2 brothers. So not a slave deal and not a large-scale transaction of a person, but a private arrangement between 2 brothers, in which this child appears to have moved from one house to another. We see another case relating to a 13-year-old named Absalmas, and you get all kinds of details of who that person is, daughter of Mathesini, and the transaction here is between 2 women, again, another private sale. We've got an 8-year-old boy, Narcissus, whose mother is named as Aphrodite, who had died, and this person had moved on to the house of Tauesus, and we've got a 5-year-old girl who's handed to another house as part of a dowry as well. So we've got lots of cases like this. I don't want to list them all. If this is an article, you'll find a footnote with about 35 references on there. So the only exception we have in, perhaps in the city like Oxyrhynchus to this homeborn slave is the foundling I mentioned in the last slide, Melos. So it seems quite a common pattern that a homeborn enslaved child, once their mother had died, they were moved to another household within the same sort of broader family or local community. And this seems to have been an arrangement that was done privately but documented in this way. But of course, there also seems to have been a more formal system of this kind of circulation, you might say, of enslaved infants. Anyway, I won't talk about this too much because there's literally lots of evidence. I'm writing an article on it at the moment, but we do have so much evidence for wet nursing contracts in this period. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example here. We have this infant being collected from the donkey to rear as a slave, with the nurse being there to raise and suckle the infant with her own milk and care for the child, for 2 years in return for a certain agreement. And this is an enslaved woman being put to use as a wet nurse for an infant. And the clauses and the terms of the contracts are laid out in quite some detail. And this is unusual in that this is an enslaved woman. What we find in all of these contracts is that it's usually a free woman. This is the enslaved one, sorry, but it's usually a free woman being paid to take on this contract to nurse an infant who's destined for slavery. And that raises a whole host of other questions about the systematic nature of who becomes available to wet nurse other children, their mothers themselves, what happens to their own children, where does this nursing take place? It's going on for 2 years. So what impact does that have on the broader family situations of all of these women who are wet nursing? And of course, there's no infant formula, so there's of course going to be lots of this happening and going on. And we see this kind of horrible pattern of children being exposed and collected by more formal means and by traders and slave dealers. And that seems to be more of a formal arrangement than this informal one that we saw with homeborn slave children. So, the decision to nurse children or infants as a wet nurse was partly to draw profit from the system, from the perspective of the trader, and we'll never know. We don't have written testimony of those who were employed as wet nurses to say what their intentions were. But we do have lots of, I won't go into it now, lots of informal, what we might call adoption contracts, where we see a blurring of the lines between wet nursing and informal adoption or fostering of children as well. I just wanted to give you some examples. I'm not going to talk through them, but we can go back to them, and obviously I can make the slides available to anyone who wants them. We also see enslaved people who are already either with a child and nursing themselves, and this is another document that we see quite prevalently from around Egypt, an enslaved girl for sale who is still nursing. And we see these documents listing shares of individual girls, not, so multiple people would purchase this girl between them. And we see this quite often, these kinds of different arrangements. I think there was a question earlier on in response to Miles's paper about the gender differentiation, and one thing I'm finding a lot in Roman Egypt, not just in Oxyrhynchus but in everywhere else, seems to be that there's at least far more of a documentation of enslaved girls and young women than there are of enslaved boys and young men. And this is partly because of the capacity to bear children and to nurse those children as well. And we do see that in the census. We see a prevalence of female slaves in those households. So, one other aspect that we find across all of this material is the movement of children. So the enforced movement of children, short distances and long distances as well. So I'm just going to give you some of the examples that I've come across that I think tell us some interesting things, or at least raise some interesting questions that haven't really been posed before. And to try and think about ways we can try and understand some aspect of the trauma of slavery, particularly as felt by children, and whether or not that's in essence in any way different to or similar than the trauma felt by adult slaves as well. So we find in lots of documents enslaved children who've been sold and resold not just once but often multiple times. And it's worth asking the questions of what the expectations are there, what kind of systematic trends do we see where children are being sold time and time again, what are the reasons for that, and where do we see it? We obviously know that separating children from their parents and their families is a very extreme version of what Orlando Pattison had referred to as this kind of natal death and social death, natal alienation as well. We've got examples where an 8-year-old girl being sold again between two women, another girl aged 12 being moved simply to another house in her own neighbourhood, and then a 14-year-old boy, Serapis, being moved to a house due to the partial sale of a house. We also have these nursing infants being moved around as well, especially being referred to as hypotithios, under the breast. So we've got lots of documents that list those nursing infants. And unfortunately, we also have documents selling wet nurses, offering the option of the infant as part of the deal. Is there a fire extinguisher? So we see this in this example from Oxyrhynchus, a young female slave and her infant son being purchased in accordance with various rules. But it's the longer distance moves. So it's not just between houses in the same neighbourhoods or communities or between family members because the child's mother has died. We see this kind of move around Egypt. So Epaphroditus was sold 3 times, as a 1-year-old, as a 7-year-old, he's listed in the Oasis, and then when he's 8 years old in the city of Oxyrhynchus. And the documents detailing these transactions list the previous enslavers, they list the previous places in which these children were located. So we see that quite frequently. Sometimes these movements and sales follow each other in rapid sequence. So here we've got, in that previous example, being sold quite locally, but still a great distance for a child, within the last 1 year, between 7 and 8. For some children, a sale would imply a move over a great distance and a complete loss of familial culture, even language, and all kinds of anything familiar to them. So in one case, like this one, the girl Rufina, who's originally listed as a Moor from Caesarea Mauritania, was sold in Rhodes, where the document was drafted, and when she was 10 years old, that's where we find her in this document, and then moved on again in her teens, where she ended up in Oxyrhynchus. We see this in quite a few documents. Here's another one, the 12-year-old, I think it's microphone, I'll shout, the 12-year-old Procopton, an Arabian boy from Bostra, ends up also in Oxyrhynchus in 265 CE, seemingly only at the age of 2. And he'd already had a history of 2 previous sales behind him, both in Bostra in the province of Arabia. And his age is disputed, as some of the ages are in these documents, but that's a whole set of different questions. We also know of a 14-year-old boy from Gaul who was named Argutis, moved to Sinaway in one document in Egypt in 359 CE. A 12-year-old Syrian girl named Zonina sold for the third time to a woman named Aurelia Alias in 282. And we have these cases in Egypt where we see children who'd been enslaved in Asia Minor, in one case in Paphlagonia, she ends up in the village of Karanis, and one from Pontus, a 13-year-old girl and a 13-year-old boy who end up in Heracleopolis Magna. I can never say that. These are villages, these are small villages in the countryside of Egypt, and these are very, very long distances. And this leads me on to the final question I want to end with, is this obvious evidence of a more systematic pattern of trafficking of children? We've got in more cases, as well as these, in 142, we've got a 10-year-old Galatian girl, I think I've got this on the slide here, a 10-year-old Galatian girl named Abascantis, who's been sold between two Alexandrian men who are named as Artemidorus and Pamphilos. We've got another Alexandrian trader shortly afterwards dealing with other Alexandrian men selling a 12-year-old girl. And we have a horrible case here of this girl, Nike, an Arab girl, transferred into a Roman legionary care. So it's of course easy to make assumptions about the nature of this kind of movement of young girls in successive quick sales, and it seems to have been, in my view, and I think Judith Edmonds-Grubbs has argued this as well, relating to Alexandrian slave dealers. These people were known as slave dealers, engaging in the long distance trafficking of children to this part of the countryside of Egypt. So it's clear that there's a constant threat for children who are enslaved of being sold into a foreign household, or even a foreign part of Egypt, or even a foreign land altogether. It's a very real threat, and for children in particular, this must have been felt with a lot of fear and a great deal of intensity, and that risk became a reality for quite a lot of children. The trafficking of children was likely for sexual exploitation, and it's likely and potentially, I would say, of the scale that research into ancient child slavery has just not yet fully appreciated or even studied to any degree. And I think the material from Egypt does give us quite a lot to work with if we ask the right questions. We do have lots of evidence, I'm conscious of the time, we do have lots of evidence of the other uses to which child slaves were put. Christian Leis has written a lot about this in terms of work and labour, but we also find in the Egyptian material apprenticeships for children, and quite a few of those apprentices in contract were also slaves, and from the same households as free children who were part of the same documents as well. So I realise I've raised lots of questions. What was the relationship between slave children and free children in the same households? What was the nature of this widespread geographic scope of the circulation of children through exploitation of one form or another, but certainly slavery and often trafficking and sexual exploitation? And why is there not enough written about this? And I'll end on that.